The Paranormal Network invites you to accompany us on a new journey where we'll take you inside some of the most compelling and mysterious close encounters ever recorded. We'll examine the evidence, we'll listen to the witnesses, we'll consider every possibility. Join us as we investigate history's most infamous UFO incidents. When we think of an alien abduction, what do we usually picture? An unassuming person seeing a strange light in the sky descend towards them, a sudden and disorienting kidnapping, a room filled with unusual gray beings with large eyes, bright lights, cold slabs, medical experiments, probes. And then a startling reemergence back to the real world, perhaps some missing time that can't be explained, the feeling something happened, something extraordinary and frightening, but the person in question can't remember what. Not until someone helps unlock those memories. Then the lights and troubling instruments come flooding back, the knowledge that you didn't imagine it, you didn't dream it. It happened to you. That's the story of Barney and Betty Hill. They've been called the Adam and Eve of alien abductees. They set the standard. Their case is the one that really started it all. The prototype for what has become all too familiar throughout the years for fans of science, science fiction, and otherworldly encounters. Those images of poking, prodding, gray creatures, Betty and Barney brought them to the forefront. And the same way we always wonder, did it really happen? When we think of those other outlandish tales, we have to wonder the same this time. Even if they were among the very first to have reported an alien abduction in U.S. history, were the Hills making it all up? And if so, what did they have to gain? And if they were telling the truth, well, you listen to their tale and let us know if you'd ever come to terms with the reality of that fateful night. Let me take this opportunity to thank you all for watching UFO Incidents and ask that if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now. Like this video and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. Now, back to the show. It was September 1961 and Barney and Betty Hill were returning from an impromptu honeymoon en route from Montreal to their home in New Hampshire. Barney was a postal worker, Betty a social worker. Both were active in the civil rights movement, worked with the NAACP. Their status as an interracial couple, not exactly an easy one in those times. They were well educated and well regarded, two affable, intelligent people who just had needed a break. Barney decided a trip through Montreal and Niagara Falls was what the doctor ordered. Some accounts say the decision to take the trip was so on the spot they hadn't even gone to the bank before it closed for the weekend. They didn't have a ton of dough to their name, but they were going to make the best of it. They didn't forget their dog, however, Delcy the Dachshund, who they evidently just adopted 6 weeks prior to go take the vacation as well. It was just a weekend, however, and soon it was time to go back home. The drive from Montreal to their house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire was somewhere in the 5-hour range. At a certain point, they stopped at a Vermont diner around 10 p.m. to recharge with some coffee, and it was still some time to go before they could hit the sack. A few hours to go. It was around midnight on that dark and lonely trip home near the White Mountains when they realized they were being followed. This wasn't some tailgater, at least not the kind any alarmed driver might be used to. A light in the sky, dim at first but becoming disarmingly clearer by the minute, was on their tail. Betty was the first to notice it. Initially, she thought it was a regular aircraft. Then she thought maybe a particularly bright planet pulling some kind of optical illusion on her tired eyes. But before long, it was clear that this wasn't your usual aircraft. It was being piloted. That much was clear in terms of the way it moved around and seemed to come ever closer to their car. But it was no airplane or helicopter. Delcy reportedly started getting nervous in the car's back seat, whether it was due to the strange light in the sky or just because it's what dogs do when it's time for a walk. That's anyone's guess. Barney pulled the car over at a picnic area so Betty could help stretch Delsie's legs and Barney could get a better look at the oddity above them. Pulling out a pair of binoculars, Barney studied the thing but couldn't get a read on it. After a moment, Betty took up the binoculars too, and the sense that this was no ordinary light in the sky became ever clearer. As he would later recollect, Barney wanted it badly for it to be an airplane, a logical conclusion, but Betty was steadfast in her assessment that it was nothing of the sort. The couple and their furry companion took off again, and sure enough, the light took off after them. Eventually, the couple found themselves on a more isolated stretch of road, seemingly far away from the relative comfort of the highway. They had to slow their speed down in order to navigate the terrain, all the while keeping an eye on the persistent aircraft that was in pursuit. At a certain point, the craft was directly over them, and the lights from it were making it nearly impossible for Barney to continue driving. Barney slammed on the brakes and pulled out a .22 pistol that he'd stashed under the seat in case of emergency. Although this was probably not the emergency he'd imagined, Barney exited the car to aim the gun at the thing, which was anywhere from 50 to 80 feet off the ground. But he's not even able to think about making any kind of threat when he sees what's inside the craft. Through the window of the craft, which was large and circular, flat like a pancake, brimming with bright lights, Barney is able to make out approximately a dozen figures staring back at him. They were humanoids dressed in shiny black garb. He can't make them out well, but he is able to hear them. They speak to him via telepathy. One of them tells him to stay where he is. Barney was having none of it. Panicking, he gets back in the car and tells Betty he thinks these things are here to abduct them. He slams on the gas and they start racing down the road again. Betty, who it would turn out later had much more of an interest in science fiction than her husband, looks out the window behind them and is in awe as the craft gives chase once again. Right around that time, the couple began hearing a strange beeping noise all around them, the location of the noise indeterminate. Accompanying the beeping is a tingling sensation in their bodies that comes out of nowhere. It runs through their extremities and fills them with a sudden drowsiness. And when this sensation finally passes, it's suddenly 2 hours and 35 miles later. The Hills get to their Portsmouth home around 5 a.m., much later than they should have. They find they cannot quite recall how they got back, nor do they remember much of anything that's happened during the past few hours. Did the light in the sky really exist? If so, did they just escape being swept up by it? Do they have a story of a near abduction to tell baffled friends and family? Years later, Barney and Betty Hill would discover it was not a figment of their imagination. In fact, more happened to them on that night than they could have possibly prepared for. The disoriented couple were shaken but confused about what had happened to them. They knew something had, but they could not say what. There was evidence to suggest something odd had occurred. Betty's dress was ripped. Barney's shoes were all scuffed up. The strap on the binoculars had been snapped. Their car had all sorts of odd circular blotches on it. They couldn't shake the feeling they had been contaminated somehow, both feeling the need to take showers. Barney even got it in his head that he had some kind of strange sexual encounter. The couple tried to make sense of their evening, but cannot summon the answers. Betty was told by her sister to contact the nearest Air Force base, which was called Peace Air Force Base, located conveniently in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Major Paul Henderson takes her statement. She relays seeing the craft and provides a crude sketch of what it looked like, but she leaves out the part about the humanoids within for fear of being thought of as a crackpot. The Major quickly comes to the conclusion that what the couple saw was Jupiter, and the report was thrown out. No help there. The couple eventually went back to their lives, although not back to normal. Betty began to have extremely vivid and troubling dreams of being kidnapped by strange little creatures, dreams of experiments in a bizarre room. For his part, Barney doesn't acknowledge having similar dreams, but does suffer from anxiety. He feels as though he saw something he doesn't want to remember. Betty begins to do research on the subject, studying up on alleged UFO encounters, which were still novel at the time, but slowly and surely drifting into the mainstream thanks to comic books, fantasy novels, and the sci-fi movies of the 1950s. Eventually, she reads up on the subject of hypnosis, specifically the use of hypnotic regression to uncover closeted memories. In January of 1964, almost 2.5 years later after their disturbing encounter while in the White Mountains, Betty and Barney visit Dr. Benjamin Simon, a Boston-based psychiatrist and neurologist. Barney was hesitant to undergo hypnosis, but it would appear as though Betty's insistence on it was too powerful for him to overrule. Dr. Simon would hypnotize the couple separately for obvious reasons, and the sessions would prove to be fascinating. Barney was hypnotized first, and to hear him tell it, the experience was thoroughly terrifying.
I gotta get my gun. All right, that's all.
Barney at first recounts how he stood and looked at the UFO with disbelieving eyes. He didn't want to see what he was seeing and kept praying another car would drive by and tell him it wasn't there.
What do they want?
But it remained.
What do they want?
He sees one of the men in the craft's window looking over his shoulder at him with a supposedly friendly look on his face. When asked what he looks like, Barney surprisingly says, a red-headed Irishman. Why that? Because Barney says Irishmen are usually hostile towards black people, and when he sees a friendly-looking one, he wants to be friendly back. He describes what the man was wearing.
He had a black scarf around his neck, dangling over his left shoulder.
The man talks to him not verbally, but seemingly via telepathy.
Stay there and keep looking.
And soon, Barney becomes very distressed by the vision he's seeing and wants to get away.
Give me strength.
Before taking a more light-hearted tone when acknowledging what he believes is happening.
I never believed in flying saucers, but I don't know. Mighty mysterious. Well, I guess I won't say anything to anybody about this.
Soon, Barney believes he's being taken aboard the craft, although apparently he keeps his eyes closed the entire time because he's afraid of what he might see.
I think I am going up a slight incline, and my feet are not bumping on the rocks. They are going up smoothly, but I'm afraid to open my eyes because I am being told strongly by myself to keep my eyes closed and don't open them.
Barney believes he's in an operating room of some sort, though he can't be certain because his eyes are still shut, although this time it's because he's being told to do that. At a certain point, Barney describes a rather unnerving scenario involving his private parts.
And I thought, are they putting a cup around my private parts?
Before he knows it, Barney is returned to his car, which has been turned off. Inside it, under the seat, is Delcy, the dog, wrapped up in a tight ball. Barney gets inside the car and soon sees Betty, and his conclusion to the tale might be the strangest part of all.
I see a bright moon, and I laugh and say, well, there it goes. And I'm happy.
Betty's account is similar in many ways, although hers begins with an abduction by a group of men in the road. Some of these men apparently speak English and are more forthright with Betty.
He told me to take off my dress, and then before I even have a chance hardly to stand up to do it, the examiner had my dress has a zipper down the back. Yeah, it has a zipper down the back.
Then things start getting particularly scary.
They're like needles. There's a whole cluster of needles, and each needle has a wire running from it.
And those needles aren't just for show either.
And he said he just wants to put it in my navel. It's just a simple test. I don't know it will hurt. Don't do it. Don't do it. And even though it won't hurt.
But after the experiments, or whatever they were, things became surprisingly more congenial between Betty and her captors. She described a talk with the leader of their group, who offered to give her a book as proof of their experience. He also showed her a map of where they traveled in the galaxy, which Betty recounted. Betty never got her book. The other men aboard the craft objected to her taking it with her. This proved disappointing, but Betty wasn't going to let it get her down.
I won't be mad at you. It is the most, I wish I could be able to have some proof of this, because it's the most unbelievable thing that's ever happened.
With that, her experience ended as well. Supposedly, the next thing the Hills knew, they were closing in on home, their memories fuzzy, their experience a mystery. As is sadly all too often the case, we may never know what really happened that September night in the White Mountains. Despite the extraordinary hypnotic regression recordings with Dr. Simon, it could never be proved Betty and Barney met otherworldly beings on that deserted road. Dr. Simon eventually chalked it up to a sort of shared fantasy or dream. He concluded that Betty's fascination with UFOs eventually spilled over into Barney's subconscious. Presumably, he had heard all about her vivid nightmares of UFOs and the strange creatures within them, and Barney had taken them on as his own. Dr. Simon also offered that Barney, who almost always had anxiety over being the black half of an interracial couple, fed off of that anxiety while under hypnosis, as he made several references to his fear of discrimination. Surely Betty shared these anxieties as well. But the Hills maintained that what they remembered was real, that the experience happened to them. They did not seek an inordinate amount of publicity nor money for their frightening tale. It was in 1966 that the writer John G. Fuller acquired the rights to their story for his book, The Interrupted Journey, which both the Hills and Simon co-owned. Despite being part of it, Dr. Simon always maintained that he did not believe the Hills were abducted. Years later, he said in an interview, and I quote, "I feel quite confident that there was a whole experience and an experience with a UFO, if we clearly define that. It does not involve visitations from outer space, but does involve seeing an object which cannot be identified at the time, whatever it is. I think that did take place, but from there on, I think it was largely a dream." The Hills' story was eventually made into a 1975 TV movie starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons, titled, ironically, The UFO Incident, which Betty Hill and Dr. Simon both did press for upon its release, both still sticking to their side of the story. By that point, Barney had died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1969 at the young age of 46. Betty would go on to become a fixture in the UFO circuit and always enjoyed telling her tale to those who would listen, those who considered her one of the originators of the alien abduction legend. She passed away in 2004 at the age of 84 from lung cancer. In 2007, another book about the Hills was written, this one by Betty's niece, Catherine Martin, who at a young age had heard the tale of that September night and subsequently devoted her life to finding out the truth about UFOs. She was there at the young age of 13 when Barney and Betty were still disoriented from their experience. She saw firsthand that they had undergone some unthinkable event that would change them forever. She knew these people weren't crackpots or conspiracy theorists. They had a lot to lose by telling their fantastical tale, which is why they kept it so close so much of the time. She kept Barney and Betty's legacy alive by donating a lot of material to the University of New Hampshire's Diamond Library, where one can find the Hills' correspondence, personal journals, and essays, manuscripts, newspaper clippings, photographs, slides, and even some materials concerning their involvement in the NAACP. Barney and Betty Hill, civil rights activists, sensible people, well-educated, well-liked. Would they make such a story up on the hopes it would one day make them a little bit of money at the expense of their reputations in a world where they were already anxious about how people looked at them? What did they really have to gain by lying about it? And if it was all a dream, was it the most vivid dream either of them ever had or ever shared? One likes to believe that at the time of their deaths, Betty and Barney were at peace with whatever it was that happened to them. If peace could truly be made with any UFO incident.
July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.